All right, this is going to be the first part or the first video in the next series talking about how we can overcome what has gone wrong. We talked about the things that have gone wrong, the things that have come in to overwhelm the individual's ability to be authentic in the world and overwhelm the world's ability to be free from force and coercion. We talked about essentially three main elements. There are more, but we talked about the three main ones. One, existential limits, and the need to survive in general. Two, the influence of the parent-child relationship and the development of the false self within the child due to the power dynamics that are involved. And three, we talked about the state and how the monopolization of the use of force and involuntary governments creates categorical inauthenticity, the categorical inability to act for the sake of what one values. And so all three of these major elements get in the way of the main purpose of human life and the main purpose or the main thrust of a meaningful and a good life, which is in the first place an authentic life, not necessarily the only standard of a good life being the authentic life, but it is a foundation of what it means to live a good life, what it means to live a meaningful life. But it's not enough to sort of just leave you at the problem, right? It's not enough to just say, well, we've got these major elements, survival, parent-child relationships, and the state, which gets in the way of the good and meaningful life, right? As a philosopher, you want to try, at the very least, to present a constructive theory, meaning a theory about how can we overcome these obstacles. And in that way, try to provide hope or at least a direction to follow. And that's what I'm going to be attempting over these next videos, or these next few videos. And the way that I'm going to structure it is I'm going to try to move from those things which we have the most control over to those things which we have the least control over. Meaning that I will probably I'm going to talk in terms of the parent-child relationship and personal authenticity in adulthood, firstly, because this is the area in which most people have direct control over. They have control over how they behave, how they act. They have control over what they will allow themselves to think. They have control over their relationships with people. They have control over the kinds of risks that they're willing to take. And so this is the area where the person has most personal impact. Then I'll talk about the state. I'll talk about, okay, how could we possibly overcome the state, or what could be an alternative to that, and how could we get there? And this is, of course, even less in control for the individual because there is so much about the state, about culture, and about the direction of where state violence goes that is out of our hands. And much of the strategy here does not do much good for the individual, though it may lead to generational transformation in the long term, meaning that insofar as the individual pursues what I'm going to be talking about, they might be able to set up a future for, their children's children to where the state will not interfere so directly in people's day-to-day ability to live a good life and to act authentically and pursue what it is they actually value in a universal way. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about survival. Thirdly, we're going to talk about the existential limits. And this is the most out of our control. And in many ways represents just sort of the innate tragedy of existing. And there's not going to be much there to say about overcoming it. We might have a conversation about economics then, because that's one of those structures that kind of gets in the way. But that can be wrapped up largely within the conversation surrounding the state, since economy is a human structural problem rather than an existential problem. There are existential elements to it, but it's largely a human created problem. And so when we get to the conversation about existential limits on authenticity, we're not so much going to be talking about how to overcome it, because there is not really a way of overcoming it, but how to meaningfully orient yourself towards it, meaning to say, like, what should your attitude towards the existential be? What should your attitude towards essentially the innate suffering and the innate tragedy of existence be? What kind of mindset, I guess you could say, would be most beneficial for that? But today we're gonna stick in the realm of authenticity. We're gonna stick in the realm of the parent-child relationship, that relationship's impact on authenticity, the impact of the false self on authenticity, and sort of how that carries over into adulthood and what you can do as an adult to essentially reclaim your true self. Now, again, the topic is actually relatively involved, as you might expect. In fact, there's a whole history of psychology, depth psychology, talk therapy, um, religion. There's a whole industry to an extent, and a whole history behind how do we confront the false self and overcome it. So it's something you could talk about for a very long time. And I don't really want to do a multi-part series about this topic in particular, because I'm interested in just getting the basics out. And then later on, delving more deeply into particular topics or questions, etc. But the essential way of overcoming this false self, which we talked about in the video on the parent-child dynamics about how this comes about. Essentially, the child is forced to become what its parents and then its peers and then its broader society needs it to be in order to survive. This particularly happens in the parent-child relationship for a number of reasons that, again, we covered in the last episode. But essentially, the same, no matter who you are, what your parents do, regardless of how authoritarian or peaceful they are, you will inevitably be left with some degree of false selfness, some degree of yourself which you identify with, that has nothing to do with what you authentically value, but has everything to do with what you must do and who you must become in order to survive and get along. And this is an internal censor on your own authenticity. It's an internal censor on being able to both know what it is that you actually value and act for the sake of what you value, because both the knowledge and the acting for get represented internally as a sort of death threat, because the false self is associated with being able to survive. The inauthentic self, the authentic self is associated with death. It becomes this threat. And when you're a child, this is largely true. Or no, that's not exactly the way to put it. As a child, this is hard to outthink because of the innate instinct that you have, right? You simply don't have the intellectual and emotional capacity to recognize that your authentic expression won't actually threaten you and won't actually lead to your death. Though in some circumstances, actually, in fact, in many circumstances in the modern world, it does deliberately lead to your harm and death. Many parents still hit their children, for example, or withhold food, um, forced labor, these kinds of things. In many parts of the world, it's even worse than that, of course. But at least for children in the West, to a large degree, authenticity is not something that will actually kill you. Authenticity is not something that actually hurts you. It's more a result of, again, these evolutionary conditions that we talked about in a previous episode. And so the trick is not so much to the the trick is to get the truth of who you are and the truth of what you value, and to act on the basis of that truth, even though it feels like you're going to die. And this isn't necessarily at the beginning something that represents itself as a feeling like you're going to die, but just a lot of fear and anxiety. The typical experience um, is when you start to become aware of yourself, when you start to recognize the fact that there might be parts of yourself which you don't actually value, but you only took on because you needed to in order to secure love and care as a child. The first step there is the self knowledge, right? And the self knowledge is already dangerous in and of itself because it's going to expose the truth. It's going to expose how it is that you had to change yourself and what parts and to what degree those parts of yourself are false. And therefore, essentially do two things at the beginning, right? When you start to realize that a significant portion of your personality is wrapped up in your false self and what you need to do in order to survive rather than what actually makes you happy. One, it makes you afraid because you're moving towards authenticity and there's a death threat with authenticity. But secondly, the knowledge that part of you is false does not automatically generate a true self. It's the experience is not like that you uncover the false self and underneath that you have this very concrete true self there that is explicit and recognizable and that you are very consciously aware of. Um, the reason being that when you're a child, and to the degree that you were forced to become something other than what you are, you were never really given the chance to directly explore who you are. The process of authenticity is an exploratory process. The process of authenticity is essentially experimentation and testing. You get an instinct about what you might desire, then you act for the sake of it, and then you test your expectations against the reality. And that process is heavily arrested by having to, instead of acting for the sake of what you actually value, having to act for the sake of things that you don't value in order to survive. The entire process of self exploration and self knowledge in a concrete way and an experiential way is arrested by the parent child relationship and then later on the peer relationship and then later on the wider social relationship. And so when you're trying to trace these things back, you will have a very concrete false self that you will, by layers of examination and by layers of self-reflection, recognize as false. But as you clear away the layers of false self, it again, there is no concrete true self underneath because the development of the concrete true self was never allowed to happen in the first place. And so you you might say you regress to that exploratory instinct where you have an instinct of what you might want to be or what you might desire, but no concrete self because you have yet to do the concrete self exploration. And so there's that first phase of self knowledge of recognizing, okay, what is the false self, right? And then that drops into this intangible exploratory instinct that is not related to a concrete self-identity, a true, authentic, concrete self-identity, because no exploration was allowed to happen. And that transition itself is fraught with psychological pain. Again, one, because you're moving towards authenticity to begin with, which itself has this instinct of fear and death behind it. But you're also at the same time generating great self uncertainty because you don't know who you are. You don't know what you really want. You don't know what you truly value. And you have no idea how to actually act for the sake of it because your potential self has not had the concrete experience of exploring the world, right? So not only do you get fear and death and anxiety, but you also get all the uncertainty and the emotions that come around uncertainty. And that doesn't necessarily go away for a very long time. It takes a certain amount of, rational perseverance to overcome these emotional barriers to get to even just the uncertainty of self. And you've done nothing positive really at this point, right? You've maybe just stopped acting uh on your false self. And that in and of itself creates all this complexity depending on the individual circumstances. That's the kind of reason I'm talking about this so abstractly, but I'll try to give a concrete example here. If you've, let's take that piano example, right? Of somebody, let's say they had like maybe a little bit of an interest in playing the piano, right? And they happen to have some sort of innate talent for it. So their parents heavily encourage it, and it forms this false self-identity around piano or around music. And let's say they grew up to be um, a pianist, and they're really talented, and they get, let's say, lots of recognition and money from it. And because they've never had this contact with their true self, um, they their entire lives, their career, their family, their friendships, their self identity, their hobbies, all these kinds of things have been formed around their entire life has been formed around this self identity, this false self identity of being a piano player. So let's say they come to the recognition at some point by some sort of miracle that they let's say they start to feel that emptiness, right? That listlessness, that like this doesn't bring me actual joy. I've only really ever done it because my parents wanted me to do it, and I got paid to do it, and all these other kinds of things, right? So they come with a realization that this personality that's developed around playing the piano is inauthentic. It was just a false self survival tactic. And they sort of recognize intellectually that they don't have to do it, right? But so much of their life is also built around it. And so if when you become aware of this false self personality, typically, the typically the desire to do it wanes a lot, right? You can lose almost all motivation to it because it has no actual meaning to you. But you might still persist in it because so much of your other life that depends on it depends on this identity. And you but the instinct is sort of stop, right? So you stop playing as much. You start exploring other things. Maybe you you cut your practice time. Maybe you start retracting away from this false identity through these little steps, right? And that all in of itself produces fear and anxiety mixed with depression because you're recognizing that your life up to this point has been dominated by this false identity rather than something that's actually truly meaningful to you. So your emotions, even though you're moving towards authenticity, your emotions become deeper and darker. And you don't have the necessary rational understanding of what's going on to kind of carry you through, right? So you start to retreat away from this false self personality. That's inevitably going to have consequences in your life. You're not going to be able to play the piano as well, right? You're not going to be interested in these conversations with people, around music or whatever, because you recognize it doesn't really have great interest to you. And you might start to feel resentment towards your parents, towards your wife, towards your friends, towards the greater society because they have encouraged and formed in you this false identity that doesn't have much meaning to you and is making you feel depressed and anxious and fearful, right? So as you retreat from all of your identity. Um, for one reason or another, you're able to persist through all the complex emotions, and you fully retreat from that. And that's going to have consequences in your life. It's going to have consequences in terms of the money you can make. It's going to have consequences in your relationships with people. It's going to have consequences in your prestige. But even if you have the sort of ego strength to persist through all of those social consequences from retreating from this false identity, you get to all the bottom of that, and you don't have a solid identity at the bottom. You have an instinct to explore other things, but no solid identity to latch onto. No concrete sense of direction and no concrete sense of self because the concrete exploration of the true self was never allowed to happen to begin with. And so now, on top of all the fear and the anxiety and the underlying death threat and the social consequences and the financial consequences and all the stress that comes from that, On top of the sense of meaninglessness and depression that comes from recognizing that you've been pursuing false values for a large portion of your life, now you also have the complete uncertainty of who you really are anyway at the bottom of this. And this is like the experience of this phenomenally is just an emotional catastrophe. And oftentimes, it depends on your circumstances and the degree to which you formulated your life around the false self and what other options you have. I mean, to be frank, this process, the reason why it's so rare is because people don't do this themselves, right? Their mind sort of unconsciously or subconsciously recognizes the costs of giving up the false identity here and will resist it at all costs. It would rather feel sort of vaguely depressed and vaguely meaningless and vaguely anxious than suffer through this entire emotional catastrophe. And when this process happens, it usually happens at a crisis point. It usually happens at a point where the life around the false identity that's been formed becomes completely destroyed in some way, right? Through addiction, through death, through, um, I guess, natural cracks. And oftentimes, the very reason why people are going through crisis points in their life is because the true self instinct is trying to break through. And the way it's trying to break through is by destroying the false self identity. It moves within you, it puts you into all these circumstances that create cracks within the false self identity. So with the pianist example, he might even before he's recognized what's going on, he just kind of stops practicing, right? He stops putting his all into it. He retreats from his family. He retreats from his relationships, and this causes all kinds of tensions and questions, um, and reduces his ability to sell his musical abilities, and he sort of self-sabotages. He's self-sabotaging his false identity so that his true identity can emerge. Oftentimes, this is where self-sabotage comes from. So this process, this emotionally taxing process comes about typically out of self-sabotage or just some crazy external circumstances. Sort of as a tangent, this is, I think, why a lot of people are attracted to the idea of like an apocalypse, right? In some way, because, or an economic crash or some crazy devastating event happening in the world, because that would free them from the false identity that they have so far, destroy the circumstances of the false identity that they built their life around so that now they can have a chance at authenticity. None of this is happening typically explicitly. Usually only in a very precise form of therapy does this happen explicitly. But this is the process. False self, retreat from the false self, which coincides with catastrophic emotional experiences, to a completely uncertain and liquid and completely uncertain true self instinct, right? Now that's the bottom. That's the bottom of the emotional catastrophe. Because if you can get this far and you can push through that, then you have a chance at greater authenticity and to essentially get to a place of meaning that's going to be far more significant. And the timeline of this is very variable. For some people, this can happen in 3 months. For some people, this can happen in 20 years. There's huge variability in this. But once you reach that uncertainty aspect, once you reach that sense of, I don't even know who I really am, and the things that I've lived up until this point no longer bring me any happiness, any meaning, any significance, and I feel empty on the inside, but I also don't know who I am. If you can pursue past this sort of like nihilistic pit here and follow that instinct, that authentic instinct, then you can eventually figure out who you are through more and more concrete experiences that come out of the authentic instinct rather than the false self instinct. That is the happiness instinct rather than the survival instinct. But this, going from the uncertainty of the true self or just the authentic instinct to the concrete authentic self, that process is not in and of itself either linear or easy. It's not linear because you will still have regressions into the false self. I mean, for many people, this is the false self is like it's an identity, right? So it's more than just like a habit. It's a habit of being. It's a habit of self formation. It's a habit of how you look at yourself. It's a habit of how you understand your relationship to the world. And like in the example of the pianist, this person playing the piano and music is a habit of their being. And so as they try to explore their authentic instinct, um, that they may easily regress into false self personalities out of the fear that pursuing their authentic self is going to um, cause them a lot of pain or threaten them with death. Again, all on sort of this instinctual level. And so there's lots of regression, and people can permanently regress. Even if they pursue past the nihilistic pit, they can regress because the costs of exploring their authentic self become too heavy for them to bear. And they'll regress back into the false self identity and just sort of solidify this sense of meaninglessness or find some sort of external belief system to justify why pursuing in meaninglessness is the right thing to do, or pursuing in unhappiness or the false self is the right thing to do. And this typically comes in forms of obligations, especially moral obligations. Moral rules, more often than not, have more to do with justifying the meaninglessness of your existence because you are too afraid to persist with the uncertainty than they has to do with the actual truth of a moral obligation. So on the one hand, there's regression. But on the other hand, there's the fear of embodying the authentic instinct. And this typically comes up in the experience of fear. One, you want to do something, but you're afraid to do it. You're afraid to do it because it's coming out of the authentic instinct. You're not sure how successful it's going to be. You're not sure how people are going to react to it, and you're not sure as to whether you're going to be rejected for it. And these are all replays of a situation that's happened in the parent-child relationship. Because in the parent-child relationship, in those moments where you acted authentically, but you didn't get your parents' approval of it, you're often punished in some way or threatened in some way, and therefore your very survival and your life comes under threat. And so this gets repeated emotionally as an adult when you're trying to act for the sake of your authentic instinct, and this gets amplified in your mind beyond what you might rationally expect from it. So to give a personal example, doing recordings like this on YouTube for me is an act of authentic instinct. And for such a long time, I've struggled with the fear around it. I've struggled with the, going out here and doing it and being willing to do it imperfectly and all this kind of stuff. Because there is so much fear of, well, how are people going to think and how are they going to react? And are they going to make fun of me for this, that, or the other thing? Am I competent enough? Do I have the right to do this? All these kinds of really ideological justifications and fears that come out of just exploring the authentic instinct that have nothing to do with a rational examination of whether I am capable of doing it or how people are likely to react, or even if they did react in a negative way, why that would be a bad thing. And I guess the emphasis I'm trying to say here is that the emotional weight of taking a risk to act for the sake of what you authentically value oftentimes extraordinarily outweighs the actual potential for threat to your life, or even the actual potential of success versus failure. And that massive over emotional fear or anxiety or worry comes directly out of the fact that authentic instinct in the parent-child relationship was threatened with death. And so what do you have to do in these cases, right? Well, you have to kind of act on your reason rather than the overwhelming emotional experiences that you're having. But you kind of also have to play this game with yourself where you have to examine the degree to which this emotions are an actual overreaction to the present. Oftentimes, your emotions are not about the present, but they're about the past. And that's why there's this disproportionate emotionality that comes around things like acting for the sake of your authentic values. You have to do a rational, to sort of overcome this, right? You have to uh, do a rational examination as to whether or not your emotions are actually in line with the real consequences or the real likely consequences of what you're trying to do. And ultimately, you kind of have to take a risk. You have to take a risk for the sake of your authentic self. You have to, because you're not going to actually know what the consequences are necessarily. You can try to predict it, but oftentimes your predictions are going to fall short. You certainly can't trust your emotions because they're more often to do with the past than they are about the present. And so you end up having to just take this calculated risk. You have to take this risk to do something that you feel very afraid of. And not so much to make sure that whatever you do has this concrete success to it, but so that you maintain and you secure your ability to stay in touch with your authentic instinct. Because again, how do we learn to become authentic? We experiment with what we think is going to make us happy. We experiment with going after what we think we will desire or value. And that word experiment implies that word experiment implies failure. It implies that I've gone out and acted for the sake of something that I thought was going to make me happy, but it didn't, right? And you have to secure that process. You have to secure that process. Which means you have to be willing to take risks. You have to be willing to take risks that pursuing something that you thought was going to make you happy didn't make you happy. You have to be willing to take risks that when you act for the sake of what you value, some people are going to react to it negatively. And you have to ask yourself, what is the ultimate ground of my value here? Is the ultimate ground of my value the opinions of other people, which I only really take seriously because of the dynamics with my parents, or is the ground of my value my own self-examination of what is valuable to me? And of course, the answer to that is the ground of what is valuable is my own self-examination of what is valuable. But every time you move towards authenticity, because of the historical circumstances, there's going to be that risk and fear. There's going to be that fear, the underlying fear of death. There's going to be fear, and there's going to be fear about the success of whatever you're doing because of the experimentation involved. And depending on how much of this you've already done, you don't have a grounded self yet. Later on, the more you do this, the more you protect this process of the authentic instinct and take the risks of authenticity and recognize that the emotions involved have much more to do with the past than they do with the present, and get better and better at reasoning out the real consequences of an action rather than the emotionally perceived consequences of an action. The more you're going to be able to experiment openly and directly and authentically, truly, and the more information you gather about who you actually are. Who am I when I act authentically in the world? When I go after not what I have to become in order to, replay the relationship I have with my parents or my peers or wider society, and rather focus on what it is that you actually desire. The more information that you gather about yourself, the more accurate of a picture that you get of who you are, what you value, what you want, and how and what you are capable of to be able to do it. And this process is a process of greater and greater authenticity. It's a greater and greater alignment of your behavior and your own self expectations with who you really are. But what arrests that process is fear. And what arrests that process is the initial costs of turning away from your false self. And so this is what I call the process of authenticity. I've sometimes called it radical authenticity. The reason why I call it a radical is because it is oftentimes a risk, and you're sort of necessarily and deliberately oftentimes running up against the desires of everybody else around you and deliberately ignoring the desires of the people around you for the sake of your own authentic instinct is such a departure away from the natural state of things that it is, I mean, there's a whole moral complex that has developed around it, right? A whole moral complex that has grown up to justify sacrificing yourself for the sake of um, the false self that pleases the people around you. There is a whole moral complex that has grown up around squashing authenticity. And this has grown up because so many people fear their own authenticity. So many people fear acting for the sake of what they truly value because it's been associated with death and their own experiences of life. And so it's radical in the sense that it often comes up against your broader society. It comes up against the expectations of your parents. It comes up against the expectation of your friends. It comes up against the expectations of your job. It comes up against the expectations of the broader society. There is no guarantee that your authentic self has anything to do with the cultural expectations of anybody around you or the world around you. And oftentimes it doesn't. And so you have to be willing to tolerate not only your own fear, anxiety, the experience of depression, uncertainty, the financial costs that come away from refusing to build your life around something that isn't authentic. But then you also have to deal with all of the social costs to it. Everything that people are going to say against you, everything that people are going to bring up against you, everything that people are going to accuse you of, and you have to be able to be willing to pursue in your authentic instinct, regardless of all of these social pressures to do otherwise. And that is not easy. It's not easy because you have to, it's replaying that same relationship between parent and child, where as a child you were forced to become something other than who you are in order to survive, even though in the adult world it's not the same. But it's also triggering that evolutionary instinct for social conformity, in the sense that to be ostracized today doesn't necessarily kill you. Usually what it means is you drifting towards a more authentic community, which something like the internet has enabled, where you can find a community that actually represents what it is that you value. But in the past, it wasn't like this. People were killed for not conforming, and they were ostracized and died for not conforming. So actually acting for the sake of what you truly value brings with it all kinds of emotional costs and personal costs. And people might say, well, why, is that really worth it? And I can't make that judgment for you, in the sense of whether or not giving up your false self for your true self is worth it. Because even though it's very costly to oneself initially, all I can say is that the authentic self is the ground of value and meaning in life and purpose and happiness. Um, if you try to live a life that is devoted to, what you need to become to please your parents and your peers and your wider society, then your happiness, it comes at the margins. It comes at the little moments in life that you get to escape and hide from everybody else, and secretly, if you are lucky enough to even retain your authentic instinct at that point, in the little moments that you get to experience happiness in your hidden life. And many people, they do devote themselves to this inauthentic self their entire life. And they're the kinds of people who are, 75 and they're just completely bitter. They're completely dead inside. You talk to them and it's like talking to, what do you say, an NPC. These are the NPCs of the world, where they've been programmed and now they're just running a program in order to get by. And eventually they will die and their life will have amounted to nothing because they never actually pursued what it is that they valued. And so they never actually got meaning and joy out of life. These are the kinds of people that they have an underlying cynicism that trends towards, the desire to destroy other people or hurt them, because the world around them, from the emotional perspective, has colluded to completely suffocate any sort of natural meaning or joy or purpose. And I think people have a great initial fear to confronting the authentic self because of this, or they have a great fear at confronting the authentic self because of all the costs involved, all the initial costs involved. But what is relationship, and what is money, and what is society, and what is freedom, and what is survival, and what are any of these things without purpose? What are these things that you don't truly value them? What are they just means to continue living an empty life, means to continue living a life that is devoid of any personal commitment or attachment or value? That's the question I would pose. If you're not authentic, what does the rest of it matter? If you're not actually pursuing what it is that you actually value, what does the rest of it matter? Money for the sake of money, relationships for the sake of relationships, a society for the sake of society, rebellion for the sake of rebellion. These are all circular. Without an understanding of what you actually value, nothing in life makes sense. Everything is circular. Everything is a means to a means. Nothing really fulfills itself, and you live again just an empty life. And I'm sure that you know people like this. I'm sure you can sense it in people around you. So that's the cost of not pursuing yourself, which in my mind is much greater than the cost of enduring the emotional struggle to sort of get there. Another way you could put it is asking the question, is it worth it to become your authentic self? Worth comes from the authentic self. Without the authentic self, there is no such thing as worth. Without the authentic self, there is no such thing as happiness or meaning or purpose in life. There is just temporary pleasure and then death, coupled with suffering and pain. So, in my opinion, the authentic self is the very center of worth. It's the very center of worth. If you don't have that, you don't have anything. And so I guess to summarize it, the idea is something like the main cure to inauthenticity is radical self-knowledge and radical risk for the sake of the authentic self. Pursuing the authentic instinct and experimenting with it, regardless of the fear involved, coupled with a rational examination of the realistic risks involved, and coupled with a deliberate and enthusiastic exploration of who you truly are. That means in particular, one's history, one's childhood. So this can include, in terms of practical things, this includes journaling. This includes therapy, child-centered therapy. This includes self-reflection, video journaling, conversations. For instance, I had many conversations with my parents about what it was like raising me and how they experienced what their childhoods were like, in an attempt to understand the context that I had grown up in, and the relationships and the power dynamics and the kinds of abuses that went on from generation to generation, the thought patterns that went on from generation to generation. I journaled intensely about myself, my feelings, and I didn't hide anything in the journals. I didn't restrict myself in what I said, or at least I deliberately tried not to restrict myself. Every time I had that instinct to restrict myself, I would go in the opposite direction in order to be as authentic as I could. Therapy is a good option with that because it's sometimes hard to get the objective examination of who you are on your own. You can do a lot of the work, but you sort of have this Trojan horse of the false self that is competing with the authentic self in that relationship, and is motivated to hide who you truly are because your false self perceives it as a threat, because at some point it was a threat. And sometimes a therapist, especially depth psychology or child-centered therapy, can help you to challenge the kind of self-identity that you have that you are mistaking for your true self. And then also, And this is probably the most controversial or perhaps the most difficult thing, that strategy that I have for you. And that is what I call radical confrontation. And radical confrontation is the cat wants me to pick him up. Say hi, Pooper. Um, anyway, radical confrontation is the idea of being honest with the people around you about who you are and how you feel and what you think. But especially in your personal relationships. So much of so much of personal relationships can be buried in inauthenticity and the unwillingness to talk about what you really think and feel and are going through. And this is particularly the case between parents and children, where children self-censor around their parents out of that dynamic that happened in early childhood, where the child was not allowed to be who they are, but had to become what their parents wanted. And this includes what they say and what they think. And so, one of the best ways to sort of respect your authentic self and retain that authentic instinct is to be radically open and honest with the people around you, but in particular, your personal relationships. And this is not something where you don't have an obligation to be honest. This is what I want to emphasize here. You don't have an obligation to be honest. And there are many circumstances in which you may want to retain something or lie about something in order to protect yourself in any given circumstances, right? But the degree to which you can risk honesty with the people around you, particularly your parents, is the degree to which you will help to heal your relationship with your authentic self and confirm the truth of yourself. Because the authentic self is not something you simply know within yourself. It's not just intellectual knowledge or feelings that you keep inside. The authentic self is an embodied self. It's a self which acts in the world openly, meaning not just behavior, but also speech, thought, emotion. And so often, in particular personal relationships, we do the complete opposite of that. We hide who we are and what we think, what we feel. Um, and the more you can deliberately be open and honest about what you think and feel with the people around you, and allow them to react any way they're going to, right? Not Don't try to police what they feel, how they react to you, but be open and honest, right? And do this because it retains your authenticity. Again, what is the point of relationship if it's fake, right? What is the point of relationship if it's just two censored people talking to each other, right? I mean, what is that, right? Like two robots talking to each other because they don't want to offend each other. In your personal relationships, you need to be radically honest with one another. But in particular your parents. And this means, going to them, being like, depending on what your circumstances are, but and being honest how you feel, right? As you explore self-knowledge, as you sort of come to understand your childhood more, you're going to have all kinds of thoughts and feelings about that, which are not convenient for your parents and which are not, your parents aren't going to like. And I think it is really important to be able to be honest with them about those feelings, right? And again, allow them to react in any way they're going to, allow them to justify whatever actions, allow them to rage against you. I don't know. You don't have to take any disrespect, but the point is to say, don't try to control their reactions, but be radically honest about your experience. And whether they want to deny that or whether they want to be curious about that is up to them. And personally, I think I prefer curious relationships over defensive ones. But radical authenticity, radical honesty, and openness about who you are, what you think, what you really feel, what you really want out of life, what your moral standards are, is crucial to protecting that authentic instinct and developing greater self-knowledge, greater self-experimentation, and ultimately greater authenticity, not just within your mind, not just within your feelings and what you allow yourself to think and feel, but in your embodiment and how you actually act in the world and how you relate to other people. So That is the basic advice of what I have when it comes to overcoming the inauthentic relationship between that comes out of the parent-child relationship and then is further reinforced. But before I go, I wanted to talk about YouTube kind of suggested that I end my videos with personal commentary rather than begin them because it can, I guess, turn people off to what you're talking about if they kind of have to slog through, I guess, personal commentary. But I'm really trying to maintain the authenticity of these videos in general. And I don't even know. I myself have a tension between authenticity and public disclosure because I don't really know what the relationship should be, right? How do you talk about things authentically with people without sort of just wasting their time? Because I don't want to waste your guys' time. I don't want to um, burden you with personal tangents that I probably wouldn't listen to if somebody else were talking about them. But at the same time, I want to have open public disclosure where, as far as I can, as far as is reasonable and as far as is safe, as far as is rational, right? I be open about this process. And so, I'm sort of keeping this end segment to be able to talk about that. Um, and I think on one hand, I'm happy with myself because I've been posting these videos consistently, and I think there's been slight improvement. I think things will improve gradually just the more I openly talk about these kinds of things. But the practice to be even to articulate the idea so far has been pretty freeing on the one hand, but also pretty scary on the other hand, because again, I'm putting it out there in the public. And in particular, I've struggled with the YouTube algorithm. I've struggled with, I want to say, almost an addictive compulsion to look at the analytics, especially when posting shorts to see like how many people have viewed it and trying to like play with different shorts to get more views. And I've really like noticed this really strongly, and I'm trying to figure out strategies to kind of integrate it more healthily in my life, like giving myself a certain time period to look at it. But there's this competition between views and authenticity, right? Like, because I wonder, like, okay, do I want people? Obviously, I want people to see it, and I would love to see as many people watching it as possible, right? I think that's a natural instinct. I think what I'm presenting here has at least some sort of value, or the process of authentically documenting my own philosophical progress, I guess you could say, is might have some value to most people. And even if you don't agree with me, or even if the ideas themselves are coming across in a choppy way, I think people can get some degree of value out of it. So of course I want people to be able to see it. And I want people to be able to see it so that they can have conversation with me, right? So that we can kind of go back and forth about these kinds of things so I can learn from other people. Um, which is why I'm going to encourage you to comment and like and share and subscribe, because I genuinely want to have these philosophical conversations with people. I know for certain that my ideas are not 100% accurate or true, and I want to be able to develop a greater and greater understanding of the truth of the world around me and get people's different perspectives, which is why I want to encourage you to interact with the things I'm making. On the other hand, I don't want my content to become about getting views, right? Because that's when it transitions from something authentic to something inauthentic. When I start to, you know, heavily change the way I'm doing things or heavily edit things in order to drive engagement because of what the YouTube algorithm is suggesting, then it becomes a problem where it's less about the content, it's more about driving views and engagement. And this must be firstly about authentic documentation, and secondly about engagement. I don't think these are mutually exclusive. I think there's just a line there that I'm trying to figure out and understand, I guess. And perhaps it's a good thing that I'm doing that now instead of, uh, you know, if and when the channel got more popular. So, um, I just want to share that because I have been struggling with it. I'd love to know your thoughts on it. If any there are other YouTube creators out there have any thoughts about this, or even just other people, if you have any thoughts about, okay, what's the relationship here between driving engagement and keeping it authentic? Like, where is the line, and to what degree uh, do you implement that? I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. But it's just been something I've been struggling with. Um, and again, I just want to thank you guys for, if you made it this far, for sticking through it, for listening to me talk about this. You know, if you like this video, please like it. Please subscribe to the channel. I'll be doing more and more on this. I hope to get more concise. I hope to get a better understanding here of what I'm talking about, and I hope to get better at verbalizing this philosophy. Um, if you guys are interested in my writing, a lot of that writing exists on my Substack at egoandother.substack.com. So if you want to read any things that I've written, any sort of the articles on there, that would be the place to go. I tend to be a little bit better of a writer than a speaker, I think. But either way, you know, this philosophy is in process and in development, and it will be for the rest of my life. And I just want to um, be open and vulnerable with you guys, and invite you into that conversation. So again, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.